Hi everyone, thank you all for coming to this event focusing on nature connection and psychedelics. So today's event is following on from our last event, which was psychedelic psychiatry, and we had such a great response, and you can catch up with all our past events on our YouTube channel. Today we have Lisa, who is also a postgraduate student, and she'll be introducing our two fantastic speakers, Sam and Alex. And yeah, I hope you all enjoy the event.
Our first speaker is Dr. Sam Gandy, who completed his PhD in ecological science at the University of Aberdeen. Sam then went on to collaborate with the Beckley Foundation and Imperial College Psychedelic Research Group in London, undertaking pioneering research into psychedelic substances. He undertook field research in various parts of the world, including the UK, Catalonia, Almeria, Texas, the Peruvian Amazon, Vietnam, and Ethiopia. Sam also has many book chapters, articles, and TED Talks showcasing his cutting-edge research into psychedelics.
Hi there. I'm going to be talking about the capacity of psychedelics to influence our connection to nature. So just to define what I mean by nature connectedness, because it's referring to something quite specific. It's been defined as a sustained awareness of the interrelatedness between the self and the rest of nature, or an emotional, cognitive sense of oneness with the natural world. And this is something, it can't be measured in a brain scanner. You're not going to find this in an MRI, I don't think. It's you simply have to ask people. So there's a variety of scales, like the nature relatedness scale, the connection to nature scale, and they all sort of ask a suite of different questions to probe the dimensions of your relationship with nature, and you sort of answer on a sliding scale. It's important to note that nature connectedness is being eroded increasingly, broadly speaking. So partly through technology, particularly electronic entertainment technology and smartphone usage, seems to be exacerbating nature disconnection more recently, particularly in children. And also perhaps more importantly, through what has been termed an extinction of experience. So a diminished capacity for sensorial contact or in everyday nature-based interaction experiences. So partly as a result of growing urbanization and increasing biodiversity loss. Nature connectedness is very important for well-being, particularly eudaimonic well-being, which sort of encompasses sort of self-actualization and the pursuit of a life of virtue through human excellence. That's sort of how it's been defined. And this is quite a sort of revealing study published last year, and it looked at various different factors of nature visitation, watching nature on TV, socioeconomic status, and how they predicted well-being. And they found that the relationship between nature connectedness and well-being was 4 times larger than that of socioeconomic status and well-being. So this is something really quite important, and is being described as a basic psychological need of human beings. It's also interesting to note and relevant to these times we find ourselves in that nature connectedness is a strong predictor, if not the single strongest predictor of pro-environmental behavior. And it's a complex and sort of multi-dimensional construct, nature connectedness. So aspects of personality come into it. Prior sort of childhood contact with nature influences it in later adulthood. It's been described as partly mutable, partly immutable. So some of it seems to be maybe fixed, and other aspects can maybe be changed. Just to touch on the some of the psychedelic research looking at this. So there's been a few kind of retrospective studies looking at lifetime usage of psychedelics, and they've sort of all found an effect of prior lifetime total psychedelic lifetime usage on nature relatedness at baseline. But as well, there's been some prospective studies looking at sort of before and after, and one sort of small study kind of set things in motion on this front. It was a subsample of psilocybin for major depression, and it found that enduring increases in nature connectedness that were evident 7 to 12 months later. And another study pooling data from multiple studies on healthy volunteers found that people reported enduring positive changes to their relationship with nature and the environment. And that's when they were administered in clinical settings. It's worth adding there. This is a part of a study that's not yet been published. It's just being analysed and written up now. I'm involved in this. It's an exciting study called the Insight Study, where psilocybin's been administered to healthy psychedelic naive people, and sort of the brain and psychology is being looked at. And here, if you can see the graph on the right here, there's this robust effect on nature connectedness that's sustained at 3 months post session. And this is interesting. If you compare it to existing nature connectedness interventions, these are things like wilderness retreats, like nature immersion retreats, educational programs, or programs that encourage daily active engagement in nature. And they all require or tend to sort of use prior kind of intentionality to increase nature connectedness. And unsurprisingly, they're very much nature focused, as you'd expect. They are time and resource heavy, so they can take like multiple days or weeks. And notably, there's a lack of evidence to show kind of sustained change beyond about 3 months post-intervention. Contrast this to psychedelics such as psilocybin, and even a single high dose of psilocybin can kind of elicit rapid, robust, and sustained increases in nature connectedness. And these are evident at least a year later, possibly more and probably more. And interestingly, and in quite a novel sense, they can kind of yield this enduring increase even when administered in clinical nature deprived settings, which makes them quite unique in this regard. And they can achieve this blindly. So even when they're administered without any prior intentionality to change this, they still do. Looking at some of the other research that's been done, ayahuasca users have been found to rate more highly in this trait of personality trait, self-transcendence, which is related to openness. And it encompasses the feeling of transcending your boundaries to encompass more, and potentially spiritual perspectives as well. And that has been found to be a significant positive predictor of nature connectedness and environmental concern. This is a figure from some of the research that I've been involved in at Imperial, Centre of Psychedelic Research. And so this graph is showing sort of total number of sessions, lifetime sessions of psychedelic usage, and then looking at people's nature relatedness at baseline. And we found this very clear, very strong effect of past total psychedelic use on people's nature relatedness. We also found that even a single psychedelic session caused this sort of noticeable increase in nature connectedness. In terms of like the sort of mechanisms or predictors, we found that ego dissolution experiences predicted positive increases, as did access to nature-based settings during the acute experience. A few reports here just to kind of describe how this connection to nature can be experienced during the session itself. And before, I enjoyed nature, now I feel part of it. Before, I was looking at it as a thing like TV or a painting. You're part of it, there's no separation or distinction, you are it. I felt like sunshine twinkling through leaves. I was nature. Ego dissolution, again, just to sort of emphasize, that's a number of studies have found that it's an important part of the story when it comes to this sustained increase in nature connectedness. And that's been sort of observed in retrospective studies looking back, and also prospective studies, including the one I was involved in. And it seems, yeah, under a high dose of psychedelic, your ego, your subjective sense of self-identity can kind of start to dissolve and break down. And the ego is sort of charged with, you know, the perception of feeling as an individual that's separate from everything else. And when that sort of awareness or that construct sort of starts to break down, it can dissolve the perceived boundaries between self and other, and it can sort of, yeah, that it can facilitate this kind of self-other or self-nature overlap. And that can be quite a powerful experience, that sort of the memory of which leaves quite an indelible mark and stays with people. It's also a powerful sort of powerfully associated with the mystical type experiences that psychedelics such as psilocybin can occasion. There was a study published last year that looked back at people's first psychedelic experiences, and it found that the mystical experiences that were occasioned on people's first times, like of all, the most common sort of enduring effect of that was a positive change, positive enduring change in people's relationship to nature. And it's worth noting as well that nature-based settings are sort of naturally prone to kind of eliciting transcendent and mystical type experiences. The mystical type experience as well has been found to lead to long-term increases in personality trait openness. And among other things, openness is linked to aesthetic appreciation and experience. And this is important because aesthetic appreciation, when it's directed towards nature and appreciating the beauty found in nature, that is a powerful pathway towards enhanced nature connectedness. In addition, it's a positively associated with nature connectedness, and psilocybin has also been found to lower neuroticism, which is interesting because as neuroticism levels come down, there are greater psychological benefits conferred by nature contact. Psychedelics, including ayahuasca, 5-MeO-DMT, psilocybin, have been found to increase mindfulness-related capacity, even in the absence of a mindfulness meditation program. And that's interesting because nature connectedness and mindfulness seem to have this sort of reciprocal, positively reinforcing relationship where there's a synergy. If you increase one, you tend to increase the other. As well as these sort of factors coming in that sort of predict or are associated with nature connectedness, the actual mechanisms of being on psychedelics and in contact with nature also bear some sort of overlapping and potential synergistic mechanisms. These include connectedness in a broader sense. So nature connectedness is just one level of connectedness, but psychedelics seem to increase connectedness on sort of a broad front. So connectedness to self, connectedness to others, to sort of world at large, the universe, spirit, a spiritual principle potentially. And nature, acknowledgement of nature enhances connectedness, not just to it, but to self and the world at large and others. So it's a pathway to sort of broad connectedness increase. So both nature contact and psychedelics have this property. And nature connectedness the sort of being, and psychedelics as well, through the ego dissolution experiences, they're able to sort of facilitate this dissolution of self-referential boundaries. So nature connectedness is sort of described in really quite similar terms to sort of the psychedelic ego dissolution experience. Also very similar is the experience of awe, which is a feature of psychedelic experiences, but also a cornerstone of being in nature as well. And as well as sort of being associated with numerous psychological benefits, the experience of awe is that feeling of being small in reference to something much greater than yourself. So given these overlapping and synergistic sort of mechanisms between contact with nature, nature connectedness, and psychedelics, how can we sort of maximize these synergies to benefit mental health? And so there's a number of potential options here. Some research at Johns Hopkins looked at journaling in a spiritual capacity, and it found that it sort of augmented and supplemented the long-term therapeutic gains people experienced. And there's also been research showing that nature-based journaling, recording things that one enjoys or cherishes about nature, can result in a sort of sustained increase in nature connectedness. So there's real potential here to sort of combine nature-based journaling with psychedelic psilocybin therapy to sort of get a nice synergy. Shinrin yoku as well, so Japanese forest bathing, essentially an active mindfulness practice that takes place in woodland environments, and sort of it gets you to slow down and tune into your various senses, and I think that could work really well, particularly as an integration tool. Say if people have been out in the jungle or in the Amazon drinking ayahuasca or something like that, and they've got to sort of come back and reintegrate into city life, like some practice like that I think could help sort of buffer the bumpy landing of the transition between extremes. Or walks. There's been research showing that just the very simple act of going for a walk with the prior intention to sort of tap into your childlike sense of wonder and awe at the world can sort of facilitate you encountering more awe, and there's a positive feedback loop. So the more you seek awe, the more you find, and it can sort of improve mood and sort of well-being as well. And awe can persist beyond the acute psychedelic state, as well as being a sort of principal component of that. It can kind of carry over. So there's a sort of fertile ground there for sort of engaging in practices like that. Horticultural therapy practices as well, like one early study found that of 150 people using psychedelics, found all of them sort of reported feeling more connected to nature, and of those 50% of the people took up gardening as a result of their experiences to some degree. And horticultural therapy sort of gaining in awareness is growing, I would say. And simple practices like tilling or tending the soil before a session, as you're sort of tending your mind before going into this experience, and then perhaps planting a seed and taking it away with you to grow and nurture as you're hopefully sort of nurturing the insights that sort of came through your session. And the simple idea of walk and talk therapy, a few people have suggested, like the simple act of being able to go out into nature with a therapist, side by side, but into a nature-based environment with a bit of psychedelic, perhaps not like a full dose that might be incapacitating and sort of not that liable for physical activity, but maybe with a smaller dose, and that could be a useful alternative model for using psychedelics. And then if we want to sort of go whole hog, there's the potential of building, having psychedelic centers in nature-based settings, say coastal or woodland environments, incorporating biophilic design elements into the structure. And you can have like nice windows and a skylight and stuff so that people can see the vistas, the views and the trees and what have you around, maybe see the stars and the clouds and the sky above. And in that way, the treatment provider, facilitator can kind of titrate the amount of nature immersion based on the needs or wants of the person undergoing the session. It's not really feasible to take people out into nature now, certainly not here in the UK. So if we can't do that, we can maybe bring nature in to the clinic to some degree. So this sort of area of research is still in its quite early phases, I would say. I'm personally involved in 2 different studies, one on psilocybin that I've mentioned at Imperial, and another on ayahuasca usage and nature connectedness in a sort of traditional indigenous shaman-led context in the Amazon. So I feel like those 2 studies will hopefully kind of bolster this area and sort of move it forward. I think to take the research forward further, we need to have strict control over the types of settings that the natural settings people have access to, because right now we're sort of going on self-reported input, which obviously varies considerably depending on the individuals in question. So we need to be able to standardize and control the natural settings that people have access to make sure that's sort of kept consistent. So there's plenty more good work to be done here, I think. This is a paper I kind of wrote with during the lockdown, the first lockdown, with a number of different scientific collaborators, that sort of goes into detail about all this stuff, about how nature can be incorporated and why nature should be incorporated into psychedelic sessions. So if you want to have a delve into the research that backs all this up, please check it out. It's open access and freely available. One of the important consequences of nature connectedness, of enhancing it, is people who rate higher in it tend to have more contact with nature. They tend to sort of place a greater value on their relationship with nature, and nature contact is highly underutilized and undervalued as a health promoting resource, and it has many notable health benefits. So if nature connectedness enhancement can act as a pathway to greater nature contact, that's an avenue worthy of exploration. And the point that there's we are orchestrating the 6th great mass extinction of life on this planet at this time, and there's a notable lack of interventions for reducing people's environmentally destructive behavior. And given that nature connectedness is one of the strongest predictors of pro-environmental awareness and concern and behavior, increasing it, it seems to be an important thing. And this goes both ways. This reversing this trend of disconnection could help promote synergistic improvements in both human and planetary health. And I don't want to come across as evangelical. I don't think psychedelics are a panacea or a magic bullet, but they can act as powerful catalysts of connection. They increase synaptic dendritic connections between individual neurons. They increase global connectivity of the brain. They connect us to self and to others, to the world at large, the universe. So used well and used with care, they could be really helpful tools, I think, at this time. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Irvine, who undertook research with Dr. David Luke around the topic of transpersonal ecodelia, surveying psychedelic-induced biophilia, following research after the most recent Breaking Convention Psychedelic Conference.
Hi there, I'm Alex Irvine. I'm going to talk you through some research that Dr. David Luke and myself undertook. This is Transpersonal Ecodelia, surveying psychedelically induced biophilia. So Dave and I undertook this research following Breaking Convention 2019. It's a psychedelic conference that happens every 2 years down in London. And some of the attendees completed a survey, and we also sourced some from Facebook user groups, social media user groups, to kind of bulk out the numbers, because we were looking for a psychedelic savvy cohort, and we wanted to investigate their eco-consciousness and also try and understand the route by which they feel their increased connection to nature came about through psychedelic use. We got 272 qualitative responses. In the survey there was also some quantitative components, slightly less, 259 people filled that out. Mean age was 37 years old, and they were pretty comprehensively pretty comprehensive in their use of psychedelics. 93% of people occasionally reporting occasional use of cannabis, 85% psilocybin, 76% MDMA and LSD occasional use. So quite, generally quite aware of what psychedelics are and what they can do. So just to jump straight in, I'll give you some of the background on the participants in terms of their drug history and also the connectedness to nature. So if we look at this graph here, you can see the width of the the kind of bubble represents the number of participants responding in each category. So we've got never through to excessively in terms of how often they've used the drug. And if we look at mescaline, ibogaine, ayahuasca, salvia, for instance, large numbers of people reported never having used them, with very few instances of people excessively using them, whereas something like psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, cannabis, a bit more varied and actually quite more common to have been used occasionally onwards. Through the qualitative data, we did a search for psychedelics that were cited as specifically increasing a connection to nature. And here you can see that psilocybin was by far the most reported psychedelic that was directly linked with eco-conscious change. This is actually a similar finding that David undertook some research in 2016, a very similar finding that psilocybin was most commonly cited, with ayahuasca and LSD also being common. Interestingly, in our survey, about 10% of participants responded that DMT specifically increased their connection to nature, which is perhaps slightly counterintuitive, with DMT experiences primarily being of a kind of non-human nature, connecting with alien life forms in environments that are specifically non-natural. I'll give you a little example here of one of our participants' responses. DMT sent me into an extremely artificial and alien universe, far removed from what I considered natural. Human beings as some kind of conduit between the natural world of living organisms and this alien realm of technology and artificial constructs. So for this specifically to increase someone's nature connection is perhaps unusual, but it was quite common, really, 10% of respondents, so something to note. We also included some quantitative components in the survey, such as the inclusion of nature and self scale seen here. Participants were asked to choose a diagram which best represented their experience with nature or their relationship with nature. We also included a nature relatedness scale, which I've not shown because it's not very interesting to look at, but it's a 21-item survey just asking about people's experiences in nature and their sense of connection. Participant responses to the inclusion of nature in self scale ranged from, in this purple shaded area here you can see, so no one felt completely separate from nature, really. I don't think anyone did actually, and primarily ranging between those, with a mean between these two diagrams here, which suggested that people felt largely part of nature and connected with nature, and that was represented in the nature relatedness scores as well, the mean score being 4.3, which is quite in line with Sam Gandy and Hannes Kettner's work, which found a mean of 4.45 in their samples. So I think psychedelic use, certainly psychedelic users that are responding to surveys about eco-consciousness seem to have quite an increased connection to nature, with the initial reports from Nisbet, the developer of the scale for the nature relatedness scale, suggested those participants with eco-conscious attitudes were considerably lower, so around 3.68 or something. So it's a good point higher on a 5-point scale. So for the qualitative component, which would kind of form the majority of what I'm going to talk about today, that was really the quantitative, just kind of helps to position the participants in the kind of where they sit in terms of their connection to nature generally. Looking at the qualitative data, initially we separated out the psychedelic experiences that increased connection to nature and the non-psychedelic experiences, and I'm going to be focusing on the psychedelic, specifically psychedelic linked experiences that people talked about. Through the thematic analysis, we kind of developed this model to try and explain the route by which increased eco-consciousness takes place, and two main routes, three I suppose, came to light. We have revealer, which is a kind of an establishing of a connection through psychedelic use, a connection to nature, and amplifier, which is about deepening a pre-existing connection to increased eco-consciousness. Transpersonal experiences, kind of interwoven between both revealing of experiences but also an amplification of experiences, and I will go into that in a bit more depth now, but just to identify that these transpersonal experiences can happen kind of without reference to changing people's experiences or increasing it, but it also filters into those experiences too. Just to give you an idea here, I'll just move myself, just to give you an idea of how something might be encoded with this. I experience a defrag, restore to factory settings, and download a new software is been coded as revealer, something that's become apparent through psychedelic use. And then it's not just psychedelics that make me think about the environment, but they enhance this connection to nature. So something that's pre-existing that is then kind of bolstered by psychedelic use. And I'm just going to talk you through a few more examples from these themes, just so you get a bit more of an idea. So with amplifier, again, it's just about this kind of, there's an established connection, and psychedelics somehow enhance or cement this. My upbringing in a city with an amazing park sparked my love of being in nature, climbing trees, playing in rivers, and roaming free and slightly wild. And that was quite indicative of the kind of responses people who were experiences with class as amplifier. They were coming with these childhood experiences in nature and developing a connection to nature that way, and then psychedelics have a kind of subsequent impact on that experience, as you can see by this next one. Psychedelics have perhaps enhanced a personality that already felt much affinity with nature. So nature is obviously some component of a lot of participants' personality. They feel a connection to nature that psychedelics somehow increases. And I'm going to give you a couple more examples of the kind of wordings that people use to describe that. It kind of gives you an idea generally of how they talked about it. Use of mushrooms cemented my opinions, my place in the wider universe. My sense of connection to the environment has been enhanced by the use of psychedelics. I'd started to feel connection deeper and deeper. I'm part of everything. Magic mushrooms, which allowed me to feel what I already knew, increased my confidence in its truth. So again, this was quite a common component, that there's a kind of a new take on something that existing within the individual. So knowing that they feel connected to nature, but psychedelics somehow allow them to kind of get a different sensorial perception of that, so an intuition that it's true in a way. So we have routes by which this kind of increased nature connection within the revealer theme, there were sub-themes of use of psychedelics in nature, which was a common theme. As a young person, psychedelic use was mostly in nature and gave a sense of nature, appreciation, wonder, connection, awe, sense of belonging and unity. So this kind of alludes to the way by which psychedelics used in nature can kind of enhance connection to it through awe and transpersonal experiences of unity and interconnectedness as well. Another sub-theme that came from Revealer was the use of psychedelics or nature as a cure for challenging psychedelic experiences. So people having trouble during a trip actually turning to nature to help improve their situation. I'll give you an example of that. During those times when I felt it was too much for me, I've always used the outdoors and nature to get me through them. So I think one thing to kind of summarize that really quickly is that people sought nature in an environment in which to take psychedelics, and people who were having challenging experiences also relied on nature to kind of help get them kind of back on track. So it's almost using nature as a tool for improving the psychedelic experience in a way, as much as psychedelics might improve a connection to nature. It seems a bit reciprocal. So moving on to Revealer. So this is, again, the idea that these new experiences come to light through psychedelic use, and which changes the connection to nature. I remember coming into work on Monday morning and looking out of the 20th story office window over London. I saw woodland in front of me with buildings poking out between the trees, where beforehand I'd only noticed the buildings and the trees with the background. It was a complete foreground-background cognitive switch. So this quite nicely summarizes kind of how people described these psychedelic experiences, unmasking something about the world and changing people's opinion of what nature is and their relationship with it. A sub-theme within sub-theme within the Revealer theme was patterns and structures. A number of participants responded that they somehow had the structure of the universe or of an object or something they couldn't quite describe. As another common theme, another sub-theme, one sub-theme within Revealer was patterns and structures. And this was really the idea that people were, and during psychedelic use, given knowledge of pattern or structure about the universe or about nature itself that changed their perspective of nature and subsequently their kind of connection to it. So just an example here, I came back into my being, the dawn began to break and every rock, grain of sand, tree branch became reflective of the patterns that exist within the human body. So it's quite a common idea that within our population anyway, within our participants, that these patterns and structures have been revealed to them during psychedelic experiences. Jumping forward to transpersonal experiences then, most commonly unitive experiences, interconnectedness, experiences of connection with nature and the universe were reported by our participants, and that fed into both the amplifier and the revealer theme. So people were having these experiences in a revelatory way, but also having them in a kind of confirmatory way. Just to give you some ideas of the responses we're talking about. I'm connected to the same fabric of consciousness that pervades all of existence. This feeling separateness and alienation was shattered by it, and I deeply understood that fundamentally there is no separation at all. So it gives you a kind of idea that how someone's coming into the experience very much influenced by the kind of experiences they're having. That didn't make any sense at all. Let's try. Jumping forward to transpersonal experiences. So by far the most common transpersonal experience cited by our participants was that of a unitive experience, connectedness with the universe or with nature, and that influencing their connectedness to nature. So I'll give you a couple of examples of the kind of responses we're talking about here. I'm connected to the same fabric of consciousness that pervades all of existence. This feeling separateness and alienation was shattered by it, and I deeply understood that fundamentally there is no separation at all. So this was really a kind of common experience participants had, and it really fed into both the revealer and the amplifier themes. The idea that these experiences of connecting with everything really affected how people viewed their place in nature and the relationship with nature. There are also other transpersonal experiences that people cited. We have experiences where embodying animals or trees was quite common, most commonly trees and plants in our survey. My consciousness seeming to inhabit other entities like wolves, stars communicating with trees, and people citing this as directly impacting their nature connection, changing their worldview perhaps as well. It felt as if I was spread over the surface of the earth, connected by the water in which I was standing to the surface of all water. So it's not limited to what we traditionally consider alive animals or plants, also that water and inanimate objects, rocks and things like that could also form part of this kind of greater connection with nature. We also asked participants to explain how their relationship with nature has developed over time. By far the most common response was that the concern had increased, and there's a number of ways in which their concern kind of manifest. I'm now deeply concerned about the future of life on Earth, so there was a lot of worry about the next step of, I feel connectedness to nature, I'm concerned about the future. But then there was also responses that We also asked participants to talk about their relationship with nature, how it's changed over time. Primarily, people expressed increased concern about the future of the environment. I'm now deeply concerned about the future of life on Earth. This is kind of indicative of quite a common response from people, that, you know, their eyes might have been opened or their relationship might have been strengthened, and concern about the future of the planet becomes kind of intertwined with their identity somehow. And that led to a number of different kind of responses from participants in terms of where that left them. Hope for the future was actually quite a small theme. People feeling that as humankind we can kind of overcome the challenges ahead. There was also behavioural changes and kind of call to action that people felt through their increased experiences, or the increased connection to nature through psychedelic experiences. For the last 6 years or so, I've been more and more involved with environmental protection, strengthening my personal links with the environment around me. It's kind of indicating that someone's behaviours have changed and they feel bound to serve Mother Earth in some greater way. But there are also instances whereby that wasn't the case, that people felt incredibly anxious about the future of the world. I feel more and more strongly about saving the world and more depressed about our chances of doing it. So there were instances of anxiety tied in with this kind of increased concern as well. So grown to be more sensitive to, attuned to, concerned about, so people becoming more sensitive to the kind of the future of the Earth. But there were also some people who had less concern, decreased concern about the future of the planet. It was a small number of people, but it's quite an interesting subgroup to kind of inspect. So this gives an example of the kind of routes people came to that realization. We're like a parasitic organism that uses Earth as our host. Using up its resources isn't as bad as much as it is natural, chaotic, and perfectly in line with everything else. So this idea that the process of potentially destructing planet Earth is actually part of a natural process, and that maybe we shouldn't be worried about what comes next. Tied in with that, there were also examples of feeling that was almost our due as humankind to feel this. There were also participants who expressed reduced concern for the future of the environment, and it was a small number of participants, but it's quite an interesting subgroup to investigate just a little bit. Give you a quote here that kind of gives one interpretation of how that reduced concern comes about. We're like a parasitic organism that uses the Earth as our host, and using up its resources isn't as bad as much as it is natural, chaotic, and perfectly in line with everything else. So this idea that even there was also a small number of participants that expressed reduced concern about the future of the environment, and there are a number of ways that kind of manifest, and I'm just going to give you a quick quote here to explain one of the ways. We're like a parasitic organism that uses Earth as our host, and using up its resources isn't as bad as much as it is natural, chaotic, and perfectly in line with everything else. So this idea that kind of potential destruction of the Earth is part of a natural process, and that we shouldn't worry, and that there are also themes in there that we shouldn't be concerned. It's part of, like, Mother Nature will recover, planet Earth will recover, that also that we're kind of due extinction. We've destroyed our planet, and therefore we kind of deserve it in a way. And there are also conspiratorial thinking in there as well, sometimes with responses looking at or saying that they don't believe the climate change narrative, and that we should carry on anyway, or that technology will save us and we shouldn't worry. So there's a number of different ways by which it came about, but it was interesting nonetheless. So just quickly in summary then, psychedelics can increase nature connection through people with pre-existing experiences, but also it can kind of cause revelatory experiences and increases in nature connection. The revelations, the revelatory capacity of psychedelics can come through providing information about the world that was not previously known, and often that is coincident with a transpersonal experience, primarily of unity or profound insights into the nature of reality. For those who already had this kind of connection to nature, psychedelics can strengthen and cement that connection. And weave throughout both of these experiences really the kind of transpersonal experiences, primarily the unitive experience, but also through nature visions and spiritual changes. And by and large, concern within our participants, concern about the environment was increased, and there was a number of responses from the participants and into how that kind of manifests, whether there was a behavioural response, a call to action, loss of hope, or a decreased concern in a few participants as well. So that's it. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Sam and Alex, for the very informative talks. It's great to see the work you're doing, and thank you everyone for coming. We do hope to continue these events, although as postgraduate students we are quite busy at the moment, but I'm sure we will find the time. And thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.